What I'm going to do now, or next, is take this 13mm wrench and apply it to the end bolt here on the crankshaft and rotate the crank clockwise to bring the number 2 and number 3 pistons to top dead center. That will also bring the number 1 and 4 down, which is what I want, because I only want to deal with 2 pistons at a time. If I just put them all even, which some people do, and that's a viable method, but I prefer to bring the middle 2 up, get the block on it, get these rings started, and then I'll actually continue the rotation and actually lower the block down onto the 1 and 3 pistons, which will come up to meet it, and that way I only have to deal with 2 pistons at a time rather than all 4, and getting the rings started and making sure everything's in the right place. As I rotate the crankshaft, watch the chain, timing chain. Remember now I've got this brass tube that the chain will rotate around because there's a sprocket in the base of the block that will be turning the chain. So as I turn it, you should see these 2, or we'll see these 2 middle pistons gradually come up and the outside ones will go down. And I'm going to be watching in here to make sure I see approximately where the top dead center of the engine is. I'm not concerned about the pistons laying against the block here because I'm not being aggressive with it. I'm being careful and deliberate and taking my time, and I watch carefully to about where they need to be. At top dead center, they're getting real close. In fact, that's probably just about it right there. It's not critical, the exact positioning, if you're one side or the other, just slightly of being the top dead center. If anything, you probably would want to be a little, just a touch beyond, but it's not a major event either way. Here you can again see some of the assembly lube that's leaked out of the connecting rod wrist pin. So these 2 pistons now are where I want them, right there. And the chain has continued to follow along and rotate on this brass tube. The number 1 and 3 pistons have slid down into their mouths of the block. I'll remove now the rubber bands and prepare for getting the base gasket in place, and then we'll be just about ready to drop the block on. This next segment, I'm going to show how I typically prepare gaskets of this type. This is, again, the base gasket. They will fit on just like this on the block. You see I've got a clean piece of paper towel underneath it. It's not a terribly complicated gasket. But this kind of gasket, since it's not a multi-piece, it has no metal in it, it's a fiber gasket. I typically lubricate these before I put them in place for a couple of reasons. One, it'll hold it in position, and number 2, it'll, in the future, if anyone has to disassemble the engine, it'll make it easier for them. 2 ways you can lubricate it. I've used both methods I'm going to describe, but one, you can use a common grease, something like this. I've got, I don't know how many different cans of grease. This just happens to be one that I use often. You can use grease for that, and some mechanics do. Or you can use something like an anti-seize. That's what this is here. I commonly, these days, use anti-seize, and I actually will rub it right into the fiber of the gasket and then clean, the opening so that there's no squeeze out. And again, it serves the same purpose whether you use the grease or the anti-seize. I'll make sure it's uniform, it's spread equally. I'll make sure there's no excess. Looks something like that. So I've removed the rubber bands that I had around the crankshaft of the pistons. Got everything. There were the number 1 and number 4, and they're just loose in the bore. So the next thing I need to do is get the base gasket ready to install. The trickiest part on this phase is going to be to get, and it's not difficult, but I'm going to have to fish the cam chain up through the middle of the, that's what this cutout here is for, because the base gasket will set like that on the base of the engine. Now this has been cleaned again with acetone on a clean shop rag. I used a fiber, not a paper shop rag for this. As you can tell, I'm real fussy about everything being perfectly clean, almost clinically clean for this kind of thing. I don't think you can be too clean while you're working with these type assemblies. So again, this isn't real rocket science. I'm going to pull the brass tube out like that, and I'm just going to double up the chain. You can see here in my hand. I need to get the base gasket. Again, this is not symmetrical. I had already eyeballed how it needed to be placed, and it's a little tricky here when you're doing this kind of thing alone. You take your time, don't get in a rush. I'm going to take the cam chain like that, as you can see. I've got to insert it back up through the hole in the frame between the down tubes, and then reinsert, a second here, just right, reinsert the tube like that. So the cam chain is once again supported from above, and now I don't have to worry about that. Then it's a matter of carefully getting the gasket in place. You can see it kind of wants to drop in on its own. So I'm going to get it started over these holes, over these studs. Those studs are for the cylinder, pull down studs. Just carefully take your time. You don't want to rush anything. Make sure everything is going together carefully. Patience is a virtue, folks, in this kind of thing. Again, the chain is coming up through the middle. The next stage is going to be getting the gasket down over the pistons. And you can just work it down. This. The number 2 and number 3 are the first ones you've got to worry about, because they're the first ones a gasket's going to encounter. So, be real easy with it. And you don't want to rip it. If we ripped it, we are in serious problems. So essentially the gasket now is down. It's past number 2 and number 3. And we're getting down to number 1 and 4. You just want to make sure everything is in place the way it's supposed to be. Make sure that it's down all the way here, like it's supposed to be, aligned correctly. Okay, and I've got the 2 middle pistons at approximate top dead center. Again, as I mentioned in a previous video, it doesn't have to be exact as long as you've got the 2 middle ones up, the 2 outer ones down, and you'll see why when I go to put the cylinder block on. I also have rubber bands. You can see here and here on the 2 pistons I'm going to be working with first. The intention behind that is simply to center the pistons, as you can see here, and hold them in a relative straight up vertical position. And I can adjust some of that by how much tension I put on the rubber bands. And obviously those will be removed before the cylinder block is dropped all the way down. So I've got the rubber bands here. The outer pistons are just resting in the mouths of the block right now. I also have rotated the rings. There's 3 rings on these pistons. The top 2 are compression. The bottom one is a oil control. There is no pins in the ring grooves like you typically would see in most 2-strokes. Many 4-strokes don't have pins. In fact, I'm not sure if I've ever seen a 4-stroke that had pins in the ring grooves or lands. So the rings can float, but I've positioned them at approximately the gap at approximately 120 degrees. So one will be here, one is approximately here, and the other one is approximately here. Again, that's not critical, but I did want the gaps, the ring end gaps, to be offset from each other. So I've adjusted the ring end gap on the number 2 and number 3 pistons in preparation for dropping the block down. And as I showed in a previous video, I now have the base gasket in place, and that's ready to go. So the next step will be to position the cylinder block over the studs here, fish the timing chain up through it, and prepare to start lowering it down.